Ed, when you would go into the village, describe what you would see during the war.
Well, what they call villages, they're like 3 hutches and maybe a meeting place. And you knew that there were people in those villages. And we would go through on a patrol. And there's no people, no dogs barking, no babies crying. And what had happened to those people before, they could never forget. And it's what we would say is, what are they fighting for? I mean, this is nothing, but it was theirs. And that was, I've always admired the fortitude, those people, to live through things like that and to come back to where they are now. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I can think of is the wonderful people that they were.
Dr. Kim?
Yes.
Dr. Kim?
Yes.
You were in 7th grade at the time.
I was eighth grade.
8th grade. You were 8th grade when.
War broke.
Do you remember where you were in the summer of 1950? And what did you think would happen to you and your family as the fighting moved in?
Yes, it was Sunday morning that we encountered the news. It was Sunday morning, June 25th, that the North Korean army marching down with hundreds of tanks, Russian made, and my father was a businessman in American equivalent selectman of the town in Seoul, located western and northern part of the Seoul city. I was 8th grade. My father had a business in downtown Seoul, and because my house was in the road, the main road, connecting to the north, so that my parents was a little bit wary, and then brought me to downtown Seoul actually, a little bit for the safety. And then through the day, North Korean army is already in Seoul. And early in the morning, I hear the knocking noise in the business section, and I open the door. It's a steel door there, and North Korean army, female army, putting the, what in Korean, dabalchon is, dabalchon is, you shoot running, And then I couldn't hear what she's saying because she's Korean, trained in Manchuria. That's what I understood later. And she asked me something, but I found later she looking for a little nail because something, the machine gun is broke, and then she didn't correct it. So we provided that. And then that afternoon, I come out, and the people had to welcome this military march from North Korea, because otherwise you will be maybe killed there on the street. And then I going back to home that afternoon, I found that the soldiers, Republic Army, was on the face down, and that I still remember so vividly, so well. And then from there on, the war goes on, and I lived 3 months under occupation. At the time, my father put me on the suburb of Korea. He had some place there. He thought that they're safer. And then when Incheon landing, and then I came home. At the time, because my father was kind of selectman, my neighbor that was a kind of communist guy, we did not know, but very kind enough, told my father, get away from the house. at the last stage. And this guy knew that the retrieving North Korean army or their clans gonna kill my father. I vividly remember that. My father survived. I came to the United States in 1961, 50 years ago, or longer than that. Dr. Shin came, I understand, 30 years ago he accomplished. I have to say a word wholeheartedly thanking the veterans who defended Korea. I know that in the documentary, so terrible situation in Joseon Reservoir. We had, I know by studying the history, over 10,000 US Marine Corps trapped there, and thousands Chinese foot soldiers just coming over the dead body, We means US Army, Marine had confidence to survive and evacuate that area. You remember the General Oliver Smith. He was the commanding officer of the Marine Corps at that time. I know, studying history, that Marines never retreat, never backward. He said that we are advancing in different direction. That's the famous word. I understand he taught in West Point sometime, this philosophy. He had the confidence to win. And one of the veterans I see in the documentary that God helped too, okay? And then Korea became very prosperous. I have experienced during 3 months how hard that was and how hard the Korean War gave people for 3 years, and then became one of prosperous country, donor country now. And I heard that Dr. Shim said that 11th large economy in the world because of your help, because of your confidence to defend the freedom with a lot of blood and money. Thank you.
Richard, you were a medic. You were a medic over there. When exactly were your calling hours, and how many men were you responsible for?
You're a hard act to follow, let me tell you that. I landed in Korea in February of '52, first week of February, and it was very cold. And I've been trained as a medic with the infantry, and I've been assigned to 224th Regiment, Easy Company, and 2nd Platoon. So I was a medic for 30 riflemen and an officer, usually a second lieutenant. My calling hours were 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the call was medic, and then my doors were open and I was ready to go. It was, I was there when it was a permanent front line. It's the same line that we have today that we're still the armistice line. We never had any large enemy attacks. I was there 5 months on the front line. Most of the work I did there was night work. We used to send small patrols of 9 riflemen out into no man's land to kind of be a lookout or set up an ambush or something. And so every time the 9 men went out, the medic had to go with them. So there was really 10 of us that went out there. And I had 3 rifle squads in the platoon. So when Squad 1 went out, I went out with them. 3 days later, Squad 2 went out, I went out with them, and Squad 3 went out. So I got a lot of time out there in night work. I was one episode that I'll tell you about. We were under friendly fire. I don't know if you've heard much about friendly fire, but that's when your own troops are shooting at you by mistake. We were out on an ambush patrol. We were only out second night, and we set up an ambush patrol. There was snow on the ground and so forth, and we spent our time out there. We'd go out about 9 o'clock at night, come back about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't have any event that happened. And when it was time to come back, the sergeant led us back, and unfortunately went up the wrong trail. So instead of coming back into our own area, who was expecting us back at 3 o'clock, we went back up into the front line in an area that didn't expect anybody. So we got maybe, I don't know, 50 yards or 30 yards away, and they opened up with machine guns. And of course we fell to the ground, and I can still remember branches of the trees falling down, and they were shooting way over our heads. So we sent a man forward, and we used to use a code name every night. It changed every night. It was usually the name of a movie star. And so if you used that code name, they would let you in. If you didn't know what the code name was, they would shoot at you. That was what you had to do. So we sent a man up front, and he gave the code name, and finally they opened up the barbed wire, and they let us through. And as I was coming through, they were all apologizing, and of course it wasn't their fault. They didn't know who was out there. We were just in the wrong place.
I'm glad you made it.
Yeah, me too.
Dr. Chong, I know you're the youngest man of the group here. You were not over there during the war, but I believe your family was. And where were they, and what did they do as the war went on?
Well, I was born in 1957. I was really born in 1957. My mom and dad were the refugees from North Korea. They were living north of Pyongyang, which is the capital of the North Korea. I can share some stories that my mom told me. So what happened was that after the Japanese lost the World War II, they surrendered. There was a power vacuum in Korean Peninsula. The north was taken up by Soviet Union, and the south was occupied by American troops. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. And 1945, so August 15, 1945 is the biggest celebration that Korean people ever had. Free and liberated from the Japanese occupation. And however, that didn't last that long because my mom was living in North Korea, and they were classified as the hostile class, which means they are the land owners, and they were the strong members of the church. And one of their uncle fled to South for education and study. So they were constantly under surveillance by the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, which started by this current leader, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, he wanted to seize the grip of the power in North Korea. So they were executing who are in hostile class as a systematic fashion. So my mother, as a teenager, witnessed the execution of her pastor without using bullet, because he wasn't worth using the bullet by the communists. And one of her uncle became a communist. So the whole family got torn apart depending on which side they stood on. So when the Incheon landing was made and the war front pushed up, it was another day of celebration in her family because they were liberated again. But then tragically, as Chinese got involved and the war front got pushed back down, they they just packed up whatever they could and moved down to South. And just I want to tell you one story how they moved down. My grandfather had this A-frame. If you remember, the Korean farmers had an A-frame, wooden A-frame. So he had his mother on his A-frame with a blanket and his wife. And then in the cold winter, you know how cold that was. And he had 8 children. My mom was the oldest. And they were, but the cold weather, in retrospect, was a blessing in disguise because with the cold weather, the waters were frozen so they could cross the river because all the bridges were bombed out. So in the 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's the safest time to cross the river, because the ice is the thickest at that time. So as there were thousands of refugees were crossing Daedong River, which is the river that crosses the Pyongyang, and since there were so many people, they didn't want to lose any of the kids, so my grandfather had them wear the hay shoes, so it'll have a little less resistance over the ice, so they could slide. And then he tied all these 8 kids together, so in case they get lost. So they moved down, and when they came to a certain a village, they saw a church, and my grandfather's mother asked my grandfather to drop her off at the church. She noticed that she was a burden to them, she was slowing them down. And with a heavy heart, my grandfather left her in the church. As he opened up the church door, he saw so many elderly women in the church already. So he was able to bring his wife, my grandmother, and 8 children down to South. As soon as they arrived in the south of 38th parallel, the first thing that my grandmother did was to sing her favorite hymn out loud. So that's my question.
Thank you. Thank you. Ed, you received a Battlefield Commission, which is a pretty significant thing, and I'm sure you haven't forgotten that. But why do you think that the Korean War is sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War?
Korean War was too close to the end of World War II. And people had welcomed back the people from World War II with parades, and they changed the GI Bills and everything. And then everybody kind of settled down. And suddenly there was this war in a country that most of us had never even heard of. And we went because somebody had to go, because I have so much respect for the Korean people.